If you're ready to start saving massive amounts of your time every day at work, you are going to love learning about automations, and that's exactly what this video is about. In this video, I'm going to be talking specifically to newcomers to Airtable automation. I'm going to teach you all the basics so that you know how to build your own automations from scratch. Now, before we dive in, I do want to, of course, warn you that automations can go very far down a rabbit hole. We're not going to go that deep down. We're going to talk about the high level, the basics. This is truly for beginners, people who want to really master the fundamental skills of building automation before they go all the way down. So if learning more about Airtable automation basics is of interest to you, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth and this is Gap Consulting. It's my mission here to help you unlock the full potential of no-code tools, and specifically Airtable is one of my favorite no-code tools here in 2025. Now, before we get into it, I first want to invite you to join me for some templates. If you are newer to Airtable, my company has put together 5 key Airtable templates. These are the most common use cases that we see with our clients, and you can download them for free at gapconsulting.io/templates, where you can sign up with your email address and we will send those templates to you. In fact, we're going to be using one of these templates and I'm going to install it here on my screen as we move forward. You will watch me as I do that. So I would encourage you to follow along with us, of course, if you are interested in building some of these automations yourself. So let's go ahead and jump on into my screen. This is the page that will be shared with you once you sign up, and you can go to these different templates. I'm going to work with the content production and social media template. This is going to take me to that particular page. We've put together a video for every template, and we've put together some lists of things that you might want to consider for automation and customization. So specifically here, when you install this template, this will make a little bit more sense, but we will look at possibly creating tasks from a checklist for production. We might also then schedule social media posts to various platforms. And lastly, we might send reminders for content relative to due dates. Now, most of these automations are relatively simple, so we can put these together, but first we have to install that template, which I will do here. And of course, if you were to sign up, you could do the exact same thing here, and we will copy that database and we will take ownership of the copy. So first I'll have to choose where it's going to go, and I will put that in my Gap Consulting free plan here. And this is just creating a duplicate or a copy of that database. I'm taking ownership of this, so I'll just call this copy of template. And I'll give it a new color here and we will move forward. This is going to help us keep it separate from the different databases in my account. So let's go ahead and take a quick, high level understanding of what's going on here. We are in the data layer of Airtable, and there are 3 layers. Data is the first one. Then we have automations. And automations, of course, do not copy over with a template. So we will have to build any automations from scratch ourselves. And then we also have interfaces. Interfaces also, just as the data layer, this will copy over from any other instances. So right here, just by installing the template and creating our own duplication, I have the same interfaces that are provided within that template. And this is really just a way that allows us to access the different data inside of this database in the way that makes sense for our workflow. This is not the purpose of today's video, but if you are newer to Airtable, I would strongly recommend taking a look at interfaces, and we've done a ton of videos on this topic. But we want to, of course, focus on the automations layer. But in order to build an automation, we have to have an understanding of what's going on here. So let's actually flip back to the page where we downloaded that template. And what I have here is just a breakdown of what we might consider for automation. So one would be creating task checklists for production. So let's figure out what that might mean. We have a piece of content here, right? And each record represents a piece of content for our database. And we're suggesting that maybe we have tasks that we have to go through every time we create a new piece of content. Now, I've done numerous videos on creating more robust automations, but because this is beginner level, we're going to break this down step by step. So first, we're going to add a table for tasks. So I'm going to create a new table here, and I'll call it tasks. And of course, most importantly, I need these tasks to link to our content so that every time we have a piece of content that we're creating, let's say right here, we have a piece of content called The Future of AI in Tech Consulting. All right, so I might have a set of tasks that are required before that content is ready to be published. So let's build a linked relationship here, and we can do this anywhere. It doesn't have to be in any certain position. We can just add a new field and we can add a link to tasks. And when I look here, you're going to see it's a link to the tasks table. And because a piece of content can consist of multiple tasks, we will allow it to link to multiple records. When we build that link, as we've just done, when we go over to tasks, we're going to see the reciprocal of that link. So tasks is also linking to contents. And of course, a task should only be connected to one piece of content. So we might imagine that, we've got these tasks, like I could say task 1, task 2, and task 3. But we could imagine, of course, there's more to just this than task names. So maybe there's a specific person who is going to be assigned to these tasks. So we could call that a user. And in Airtable, we have this user field type. So whoever has access to this database or interface, we can add them as the people in charge of these various tasks. And we could also assign due dates to things, right? So we can have a due date. And of course, this will be a date field type. And we don't care about time per se. It's just due on a particular day or by a particular day. And so we could imagine that, hey, look, we've got, this piece here might have had 3 different tasks. And I'm the only person here as a user. So we would just assign those to me. And maybe the due date is somehow relative to the piece of content itself. So if we go back to that piece of content, we've got a release date. And maybe all tasks are due, let's say 5 days before the content is going to be released. So in this particular case, I'm looking at a complete guide to remote work tools. That was going to be launched on December 20th, 2024. And so if we went over to here and did 5 days prior, let's get to December 2024. And 5 days prior to the 20th would be, well, if it was 5 business days, it would be a week before, right? On the 13th. And so we might just take that. So this is what we would expect these tasks to look like. And then, of course, each task will have a status. And we might have a single select field here with a couple of different options. We could say pending and maybe complete. And we'll keep it very simple with that. So this way we can say, look, we had these 3 different tasks. They were assigned to Gareth. They were due 5 business days before the publication date. And as those things were completed, Gareth was able to see his task list and mark them off. But we don't want to create tasks manually every time. That would be a huge waste of time. So let's get into the automation component now that we have a basic understanding of the data structure that we've just built. So heading into automations here, this is where we're going to go when we're ready to build that first automation. And the first part that we need to do for every automation is complete the trigger. Now, if you've built automations in other software before, it's very similar. I'm thinking about Zapier, I'm thinking about Make.com, SmartSuite. They all follow the same rules for automation. There is a trigger and then one or more action steps. So the trigger is the instance that turns the automation on. You can imagine that the automation is kind of always there. It's on, it's active, but it's not performing its duty because nothing has met the requirements of the automation. But once it sees something that meets the requirements, that is to say that the trigger requirements are met, then the automation wakes up and it goes to work. And so the trigger is really your way of saying, under these conditions, that's when I want the automation to do the thing. And then whatever the thing is that you want it to do, those are the action steps. So every automation has one trigger because it has to have some conditions that turn it on and wake it up. And then it's going to have one or more action steps because those are the things that it's actually going to perform once it's been woken up. Right? So let's imagine then how we're going to do this. We're saying, look, we've got back in our data layer, we've got this piece of content, complete guide to remote work. And over here, we've got our content and we can see that, we've created 3 tasks for this one, but none of the other pieces of content here have tasks added to them. So what this means is, we would want to automatically generate tasks for our content, maybe when it reaches a certain stage. So we might say, well, when it gets to the creating stage, like after it's past planning and it's, got the green light and it's moved forward, then we want to create these tasks. So we could imagine a scenario like that. So maybe those are our trigger conditions. So in words, that makes sense. How do we say that in computer software, specifically Airtable automations? Well, we would say a record matches certain conditions. There's a piece of content or a record in our contents table that matches very specific conditions that we set up. And when it matches those conditions, then we are going to move forward and create our tasks. So you can see that we have a bunch of different triggers actually in Airtable. They are kind of ordered in value of utility, I would think. I think the most common one that we use is record matching conditions. Form submitted. This would be, of course, an Airtable record is submitted via a form. A record is created is a good trigger, but bear in mind that when a record is created, it might not have all the information that you need, because we're going to get contextual information from the triggering record, as you'll see in a moment. And if a record is created and it's blank or it doesn't have a lot of information, then this might not be the best trigger for you. You might also look at when a record is updated. You could do a scheduled time, and you can set that time or that interval. So you could say every week on Monday at 8 a.m. You could say every day at midnight, like whatever you want the scheduled time to be. You can trigger an automation via time. You could set up a view in Airtable so that anytime a record enters that view, because you've applied specific filters, for example, then that could trigger the automation. But do note that you've got more than this. You can scroll down also and see when a webhook is received, when an email is received. Of course, this requires you're on that business tier with Airtable. When a button is clicked. Now, this one is great if you're using interfaces, and I strongly recommend that you do. You can put buttons in your interfaces so that people can push those buttons when they're working in the interface and trigger an automation. Very valuable. And then we have third-party tools that integrate with Airtable natively. And these are the big tools that you might already be using, like a Google Calendar. So you could say when an event is created, or when an event changes or is canceled, or you could say when we receive something in Google Forms, or we have Google Sheets when a row is added. And then you've got Outlook. So Outlook email is received, Outlook calendar for event created or changed. So a lot of different options, but I would say by and large, the majority of the time when we're building Airtable automations, we're triggering off of Airtable actions. So let's set up our record matches conditions. Remember again what I said earlier, a trigger is simply the conditions that have to be met for the automation to wake up and start doing its thing. Okay, so what are our conditions? Well, we have a piece of content. So when a content record matches conditions, and what are those conditions? So number one is going to be the stage of content, right? So we could say the stage of content is creating, or we could say is any of, and then we get multiple options. We could say it's any of, let me open this up a little more, is any of creating, editing, publishing, or complete. Now, bear in mind that it's not going to trigger the automation when it moves from creating to editing and then to publishing, right? If we just saved this as it is, the only time the automation will be triggered here is if the record meets the conditions from a position where it did not meet the conditions. And that sounds a little funky, so let me kind of break that down a little more. What I'm saying is, the record, the first time it meets those conditions, will trigger the automation. But if it continues to meet those conditions, even if a status is changed in the meantime, it's not going to re-trigger because it's still meeting the conditions. It never stopped. If it stops meeting the conditions, for example, if it gets moved to creating and then gets moved back to planning and then gets moved to editing, now it would trigger the automation again. Because when it goes to creating, boom, that triggers the automation. When it goes back to planning, it's almost like you hit the reset button. And then when it goes back to editing or goes to editing, that is going to trigger it again. So if we want to prevent it from triggering multiple times, what can we do? Well, what are we doing in our automation? We're creating tasks, right? So let's say that another condition is that the tasks link is empty. So this way, when we create tasks via automation and we add them to the piece of content, then we're saying, look, if the tasks is empty, then it can trigger the automation. But if tasks are already created here, I don't want to ever initiate this automation again. So there's a lot of value in thoughtfully building your triggers. And that's what I'm trying to demonstrate for you here. We don't want the automation to build all these tasks for us over and over and over again. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. We only want it to happen that one time. Now what we're going to do is actually choose a record and work with it throughout our automation. So we talked about using the future of AI in tech consulting, so let's make that selection. Notice that when we are choosing a record here, we only see the records in our database that meet the conditions that we built. So this is a sanity check for you to make sure that you put your conditions in a way that makes sense. If you thought you built conditions that would show you records and you don't see any records here, then you need to check your records. It's very likely that your conditions in that case would be too strict, meaning that you put conditions into play that actually don't have or don't allow any records to come through. So make sure that you check your records and that you see something here as you would expect to, and then work with it in the next future steps of the automation. Okay, so now we're going to do some actions. And yes, this says add advanced logic or action. We're not going to get too advanced here. We're not going to do any of the crazy looping. We're not going to do any of the more advanced actions. So let's just stick to the simple stuff. I would say the advanced stuff is up here, the conditional logic, the repeating group, and we've done videos on these topics if you're interested in checking those out. But here are the more simple, straightforward actions we can take. Firstly, within Airtable, send email, create record, update record. Those three right here, those are the easiest ones ever. And if you send this email, please note that it's coming from Airtable, not coming from you in particular. If you want to send your own emails, scroll on down, you'll see these third-party integrations. You can set up Slack messages, you can set up Microsoft Teams messages, you can send email via Gmail or via Outlook. You've got Facebook pages, Google Sheets, Google Forms, Google Calendar. You got a lot of stuff here, right? A lot of third-party integrations. Note that you have more options on the action steps than we did on the triggers, right? So for our example though, we've got this piece of content and we want to create 3 tasks. What are we doing? Well, we're creating records. Okay, so let's do that. We've got 3 different tasks every time that we want to create. So let's get to work. Now we're going to talk here about static versus dynamic data. But before we get to that, we have to first select the table that we are sending or creating these records in. And it's the tasks table, obviously. So let's first just fill out what are the different fields we're going to bring in here. So we need to name the task, sure. We need to link that task to a piece of content. We need to add a user, and we need to have a due date. Now, I do want to point out that our status here, we have a couple of options, because if we go back into Airtable really quickly to our data, when we were in our tasks, we set the status to be pending up front. We could set a default option to be pending here, and this would save us from having to set up the status of pending every time we build a task. So by having a default value, as I just added, every time we create a new record here, if we do not specify what the status is, Airtable will assume that status will be set to the default, which is pending. So we'll save ourselves a step by putting a default option into this particular field. But for these other ones, let's get to work back in our automation, right? So what do we name it? Well, the first task we create here is always called task 1. This is never going to change, so we are writing it in here. This is called static data. Static data, when we are building an automation, is data that will not change from one version of the automation to the next, right? But I'll tell you what will change. What will change is content. What piece of content are we linking the task to? That entirely depends on what piece of content triggered the automation, right? So thankfully, we have contextual information from the first step. And we get access to that contextual information by clicking this plus. And we see here that we've got the option to access the information that we found in the trigger of the automation, right? So remember, what triggered the automation? It was a record in the contents table. And so when we say, look, I want to access some of the data from that record, we're accessing it right here because it was the triggering mechanism of the automation. And the Airtable record ID here for the piece of content is this one. So what I've done is I've said, look, I'm linking this task and I'm assigning it to the piece of content that came from the trigger. Pretty simple. Now for us, our user is always me, right? But our due date is going to flex. So this is static data, never changes. But the due date will change. It's going to change relative to the launch date or the release date of the content. So we have to hit the little gear icon over here, and we're switching to dynamic data. Remember, dynamic data is the data that's going to change. Static data is the data that's always the same. Okay? Hit that plus now that we're over to dynamic data. And again, it's relative to the release date from the triggering piece of content. So let's scroll down and find the release date. Here it is. But wait, I can't actually do any math to the release date inside of this particular function, right? I can modify it, uppercase, lowercase, capitalize, do a little trim, do any of this, but I can't do any math to the date, unfortunately. So let's fix it. Let's go back to our data and we'll go to the contents table and let's actually calculate that date that we need for our automation. So this will be the task due date. That's what I'm naming it. And I'll use a formula field. And I can use the date add function here. We'll go here and I will first apply it to the release date. And I will say, I want to actually subtract, let's subtract a week. So I'll say -1 and week. So what I'm doing is calculating a date here, and I'll output the date without time. I'm not so worried about the time zone. We can do that. It's fine. And so we're saying, look, we're subtracting a week from this. And of course, I put this in my local time, and this one is in Greenwich Mean Time. So let me fix that on the formatting side of things. Let's not worry about the display zone, but let's use the same time, and we're good. And this date will make a lot more sense now. So we see we've subtracted a full date. All right. Now, I'm glad that we got to go through this extra step because now we have to pull that data back into our automation. So back over here, let's go and actually bring it back. Before we do it, if I hit that plus right here, you'll see that do I have access to that new formula? And what do we call it? Task due date? I do. I have access to the task due date right here. Many times when we're building automation, though, we have to go back to the trigger and re-choose a record to make sure that we're able to load the new information that we've added to that record. And if I go in here and I look at my task due date, I'll bring that out and we'll look for it again here. This time, you'll see that I actually have data in the task due date. Now, previously, it was blank. Like Airtable knew that there was a field there, but it didn't know what the value was because I hadn't pulled it in. So now we went back to the trigger, we pulled it in, and we're good. So sometimes you want to do something in an automation that you can't quite do, but you can find a workaround. So in our example, we went back to the actual data itself. We changed the date or modified the date that we were looking for so that we could bring in a due date here. Now we've set this up perfectly, but we need 3 of these. Easy enough, duplicate the action. The only difference here is this second one is going to be task number 2, and then I'll duplicate it again. And this last one will be task number 3. So we are now, whoops, I'm in the wrong one. Task 2, now select the record, and this one will be number 3. So we're good to go now, right? We name our automation, always do this, it'll keep you organized, and then turn it on. If you don't turn it on, nothing's gonna happen. And remember what we were saying about how to trigger an automation. Now that we've turned it on, these records are already meeting that criteria. So in order to trigger it, we first have to remove them from meeting the criteria. So I'll move it back to planning. Actually, let's do this one, the future of AI and tech consulting. I'll move it to planning. It is now not meeting the trigger. And now I'll move it back to complete. And this will then trigger the automation. And just like that, you saw 3 tasks being created for this. And if I flip into tasks, let's go ahead and group here by the piece of content. You'll see that we properly created those. These are the ones we just created, future of AI and tech consulting, assigned to me, due 5 days or a full week before the due date of the project, right, or of the content, task 1, 2, and 3. And they were all assigned the pending status because it's the default status. And since we didn't specify a status, it got assigned here. So that's it. Those are the key building blocks of Airtable automation. 1 trigger for every automation, 1 or more action steps following the trigger, and you've got yourself a lot of time saved. My last piece of advice here is to consider the massive time savings you get from building automations like this. It might seem simple enough, and you might think, why would I take 10 minutes to build an automation that's going to save me 3 minutes? But if you think about the compounding effect of, the effort that you put in, when you build this automation and it creates saves you 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day over a year is like 20 or more hours of time saved. So putting the time in to build these automations will pay massive dividends for you on the back end if you use them intelligently. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. These things can go, as I mentioned earlier, to the nth degree. You can build PDFs, you can send information to other tools like your accounting software, your payment processor. All kinds of stuff is possible when you start having your software connected on the internet. I hope you got a ton of value from this video. If you did, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up here. Of course, if you have questions we didn't answer, feel free to swing by our website. We have a ton of solutions and resources available for you there. But most importantly, my friend, keep on building.